first webinar hosted by Techion. We've been involved in many different webinars for various parties, but this is the first one that we're actually hosting as Techion. Great to see such a good response. Just a bit of introductions. Those who don't know me, I'm Eurion Thomas of Techion. I look after Techion's operations here in the UK and across Europe. Actually, I might stop sharing this just for the kind of start bit, and we'll go back to share the screens afterwards. Operations Manager here in the UK and Europe, and I've been involved in parasite control and with FECS for a number of years. It's getting quite scary now. This is over 17 years. 2003, I started on the FECS and journey, and by picking up the poo journey, as you do, and been involved ever since. At that stage, I was working with Innovis and doing various other things, but since 2014, since we bought the Generation 2 FECS out, and we set up Techion UK as the UK arm of the Techion business, I moved over to head those operations up. It's also a pleasure to welcome our guest panelist tonight, Lesley Stubbings. Lesley, as many of you will know Lesley, doesn't need introductions, but well known to most of you, one of our leading, if not the leading, but let's say one of our leading sheep consultants here in the UK. And Lesley's been instrumental in the setting up of SCOPS, which we'll discuss in a wee while. How many years ago was this, Lesley? How many years was SCOPS set up?
Well, almost as long as you've been at Techion. It's 2004. Yeah. So yeah, 3-4 about the same time.
Not far off, yeah. And I've known Lesley sort of through these kind of since those days, really. And yeah, instrumental in setting it up and a driving force behind SCOPS to this day. So it's great to have you with us, Lesley, to share your knowledge. And how's lockdown been in the Midlands for you?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. We're getting there. As my clients keep telling me, we're usually in isolation with sheep people anyway. So yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Just very dry.
Places to be isolated, and welcome to the audience as well. And it's great to see so many. I think we've got touching on 150 or maybe a few more now. They've been flooding in the last half hour as well. There's some extra wins, some last minute wins. So it's great to have so many people joining us. Sort of over 150, as I said, around there. And we've got a great mix actually of different types of listeners tonight. We've got a good number of farmers. We've also got veterinarians who are interested in sheep. Great to see so many of them here. And also a strong representation from the distributors, the animal health distributors as well. Our SQPs, or sorry, RAMers, as we are meant to call them now, I believe. And within those three sections, there's a good mix between those, but within those, there's actually a good mix of clients of ours, people already on the FECS system, but also some non-clients, sort of show that you're doing your own thing for fecal egg count monitoring, etc. So yeah, it's great to have a bit of a mix of kind of clients and people where we may be a bit more new to. And there's also a bit of an international field this evening as well, with a number from overseas. We've got France, Sweden, Brazil and Mexico, I believe, as Pakistan and Malaysia. So a couple of interested parties from those parts of the world, which is great to have you. So we'll get into it. I think, yeah, there's several more joined in now. So I think we're pretty much there. So if I share the screen again, Lesley will tell me if that's working with the webinar there.
Yeah, that's good.
Excellent. So get to the, that's it. Excellent. So a little bit of housekeeping to start off with. We're not expecting any fire drills this evening, but in the event of any alarms going off, and I'm expecting that you know where your own fire escapes are. But no, on a serious note, sort of just in terms of the housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded this evening, that you're all aware. As I said, you're all kind of, your videos are off and microphones are off anyway, so it's only relevant when it comes to the Q&A session and the questions, that you're aware of that. But we are recording it for others to see at a later date if they wish to. As I said, your videos and mics are automatically turned off. That's because of such a high volume of people that we've actually needed to turn them off and make it easier to run this. But we do really want a good question and answer session. So the way that's going to work, if you, those not familiar with these kind of platforms and on Zoom, you can use the question and answer function. And if you just play around with your mouse a little bit and wake your screen up, I think either at the bottom, possibly at the top, but at the bottom of your screen, I think you'll see this kind of brown bar. There might not be as many things on there, but you'll see a little Q&A tab there. You can actually go on there and actually post your questions. There's also a chat function there. And there's also, you can actually vote for questions already posted as well. So that saves people asking the same questions. If you want, if you have a look what questions are already there, you can have, I think you can give them a like. And the ones with the more likes are the ones that are more likely to be asked in this live webinar. We'll try to get them to them all if we can. But there is an opportunity of there and potentially commenting on them as well. We are, alternatively, if that doesn't work for you, you can email us at uk@techion.com or direct message us on our social media channels. This is especially true. We do have an overflow which has to go to the YouTube channel to watch this on YouTube. So you can ask your questions there. We've got Heaven and a few others who are keeping an eye on these questions for us as they come in, and Heaven will be joining us at the end to actually get that Q&A session going. The other thing as well, we will share a PDF of this slideshow by email after the event as well. So it saves you scribbling lots of things down with those of you with the keen beans. So I think that's my kind of introduction to housekeeping. So we'll get into the webinar proper. So what we want to cover this evening, we're going to cover in the next kind of 20 minutes, half hour or so. The focus is very much on roundworm and worm control in sheep. And for the overseas people listening in, we are probably going to be focusing on UK elements of this and things that are relevant to the UK scene, the UK and Ireland probably. But there's a lot of things obviously you can take from it, but just be aware of that. This is very much written with an UK and Irish audience in mind. So we're going to talk about the challenging year that we're in. We're going to have a quick review of SCOPs and seeing what kind of resources are there. But then the main focus is going to be about fecal egg counting. So obviously this is our business, so the regular kind of fecal egg counts. We're going to talk about the importance of them, how often and when we should test. Very importantly, what do the results mean? So interpreting those results, what the data is telling us. So we're collecting a lot of data of our existing users now, and there's some intriguing things actually that data is showing us. And then we'll summarize, and then we're hoping to have a good half hour at the end for your questions and have a bit of a discussion. And every now and again, you'll see this little symbol bouncing onto the screen, our pitfall symbol. Watch out for the pitfalls. This is here to highlight some pitfalls. I think as with a lot of things that we do when we're monitoring, when we're dealing with kind of management of sheep, etc., there are pitfalls we need to watch out for. And there are some pitfalls I think people may have fallen into when it comes to using FEC, applying some SCOPS principles, etc. And I think we will discuss them, because if we understand the pitfalls, you know, there are limitations to what fecal egg counts tell you, for example. If we understand those pitfalls, then we'll make far better use of the technology and of what kind of monitoring sort of a regular basis tells you. So watch out for that, and we'll be discussing those pitfalls as we go along. I think it's fairly important that we actually highlight them. So yeah, 2020, as you know, a very interesting year. I think if we could reboot kind of 2020 like we reboot computers, would be great. But yeah, certainly a challenging year, Lesley, and maybe come to you for your view kind of on the sheep industry and our marketplace kind of during this year currently, but you know, looking into that kind of next couple of months, the critical time for our sheep industry, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so, Eurion. You know, we were already facing the B word, the Brexit word, before COVID hit us. And actually, you know, in the short to medium term, COVID is going to have quite an impact on what happens. People will be aware that our industry is extremely dependent on exports, which, you know, with COVID have been messed around. Now, before it hit, we were actually looking at a shortage of lambs, and people will remember, I think, that prices were going sky high, ewes and lambs were going through the roof. And as a result of that, there was a big pull on imports from New Zealand, particularly New Zealand and Australia, to try and fill that gap. And so we ended up with a bit of an overload, which pulled prices back in the short term. And then we went into a period whereby our lambs were about 25% less coming forward through April. So we saw the price harden again. And at the moment, it's doing okay. but we are expecting that to be put under some pressure in the next week or two. I know a lot of my guys are starting to draw their first lots of lambs this week, next week. And really, as the supplies come forward, it puts pressure on growth rate. So growth rate's going to be really important, even more so. I know people hear me banging on about this a lot because growth rate is efficiency. But this year, we've got to make sure we don't trip up. So getting on top of worm control, really important.
Yeah, thanks, Lesley. And yeah, massively important. And I've got a little thing, I think improving efficiencies on those little growth rates is more important now than ever. Sort of, as I say, the marketplace is faring okay now, but if we are kind of going to be under a little bit of pressure, it's under the years that we're under pressure that these little things are most important. A lot of the things we talk about are small, maybe incremental benefits, but they do add up, but they are kind of much more important, during challenging periods, aren't they, Lesley?
Yes, they are. That's right. Absolutely. And of course, I think what's going to come up next, if you click it through, is that,
yes,
obviously after nutrition, and we'll come to talk a little bit about the implications of the drought on worm control a bit later on. But, keeping on top of roundworms is going to be really important.
Absolutely huge, yeah. And actually telling a positive food story is important as well. The whole story around that. I know our lovely Tory government haven't helped us much a couple of weeks ago with that kind of agricultural bill went through, with supporting us there. But I think it's more important than ever that we stand up for ourselves and actually tell this positive food story and how we're producing. Just mention the Q&A session as well. You might notice Hevin, who works for us, is actually posting a couple of questions on there. These were questions that we received today over Twitter and emails that we invited over social media. So again, you can see some questions coming in there already, so you can actually go in and vote. So Lesley, tell us a bit about SCOPS, just a bit of a kind of review and what kind of resources are there for our farmers.
Yeah, okay. Well, as we said at the beginning, SCOPS has been going for going on 17 years now, so quite a long while. And in that time, I think we can safely say that people have become much more aware of the need for more sustainable practices because of the threat of resistance. I think before we'll click through and have a couple of, Eurion will click through and show a couple of bits in a minute, but the one overriding thing I want to say at this stage is that, people do tend to think that following the SCOPS principles is going to actually endanger their ability to control worms. And, over the last 16, 17 years, we've concentrated really hard on showing people that by following the principles, one of which is to do monitoring with fecal egg counts, of course, is that you actually are going to gain better worm control. So what we're talking about is not just sustainability, which in the long term means better worm control, but also in the short term, we are aiming to get this worm control right. So, on the first page, we'll flick back to it in a minute, but on the first page, you will see things about news, in terms of what's happening. On this page that we're just looking at the moment, there we are. So we've got something up there on liver fluke, because we were concerned that people were thinking it had been a really dry year and were missing out on this adulticide treatment on fluky farms, which means that if you don't do that, you could be in trouble later. And if we just click on that and read more for the Matadirus forecast, Eurion, that's great. So we'll go through there. I hope people have been using that. That's live now, that's what it's showing for today. And as we can see, we're now with England and Wales, we're starting to go back down the risk gradient. So we're going back to a moderate and low risk in most of England and Wales. 1 or 2 reds there, it's still high. As we move up country, we've got some very high risk in the northeast of England still and in Scotland. And that's going to coincide possibly with some lambs that are about the right age now, that are later lambing, higher up flocks where there is still a risk of Matadirus. So that's something which you can put a link through on your phone, have a look at that. It updates every day, and people do seem to be finding that really useful. So if we just flick back, Eurion, just to internal parasites and have a look at the sort of along the
Oh,
Yeah,
so
so if you just go to Internal Parasites, and click on the Anthelmintics groups one. I mean, people will get the idea. You can see there's all sorts of stuff on there if you want to go and have a look at various things. But we just wanted to point out a few bits to you tonight, and that is this was updated in January of this year. And what you've got there, it's printable. Just get yourselves a copy. It's got all of the products that are available at the moment in their groups, so you can easily see what group you're using and also what the withdrawal period is, etc. So we keep that up to date, and that's something which I would encourage people to go and access after this evening. If we just go back to the homepage area, I know we don't want to go through too much time. Just click through to home.
To home again,
Home, okay, that's great. So you get the idea, and then along the top there, that's Scott's principles. That's broken down into the main things. So do go and have a look at that in terms of correct dose rate and weighing and treatment technique. There's videos on there as well. So there's a whole resource, and at the moment we are just updating the technical manual for the vets online. The technical manual has just gone through a review, and instead of having a paper version or a PDF, that is all, it's just waiting for a bit more stuff on there. It's all going to be electronic in a tree format, so you'll be able to access that really easily.
Fantastic, thanks Lesley. So there's a great deal of resource there for the industry to use and get at. As I mentioned, we're going to focus on fecal egg counting, and fecal egg counting is a fairly important part of SCOPS and kind of underpins a lot of what SCOPS is about. It might be fair to say, Lesley, that a lot success of SCOPS, I think we've done really well in getting the message out about dosing technique and these kind of things, and understanding the groups and the anthelmintics. We have done great inroads with fecal egg counting, but it's fair to say there's probably a lot more that needs to be done, I guess, sort of with the industries in terms of this regular monitoring.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think, if you look back just 5 years, access to fecal egg counting is so much better. I mean, the RAMAs that are online tonight and the vet practices are either they've got access to, so everybody can get access, I think, now to fecal egg counting. And of course, with the Gen 2s, a lot more people are doing it themselves. So whether you want to do it yourself or you want to access another way, it's a lot easier now. The emphasis now is on us trying to persuade people to use it as a monitoring tool and really get the best out of it.
Absolutely. So coming into the fecal egg count, I'm hoping most of you are aware what fecal egg counting is. And I just put this slide in here to focus on these kind of two. I think this is one of the pitfalls, is people not quite understanding the test, and taking it maybe a little bit too scientifically and a bit too much kind of, face value, fecal egg counting. It's an indicator test. It's an indicator what's happening inside the animal, and it's there to help your management, not to replace it. I think that's quite important that we understand, isn't it, Lesley? What this is all, what this tells us.
Definitely. It isn't a diagnostic.
Absolutely, yeah. So why regularly monitor FEC, and we'll come in to explain what we mean by regular in a bit. The reasons we want to do it is those who don't are likely to be worming often when it's not necessary, and we're trying to avoid that. I heard somebody talk last night who need to treat these nearly like an antibiotic, use them when it's necessary. And I think often without monitoring, we are often worming when not needed. The flip side of that is there are lots of occasions when we are not worming when we actually do need to. So, we might be missing parasite birds we don't realize are there sometimes. So, there's flip side of that. And obviously quite a big one is using wormers that aren't fully effective, this monitoring effectiveness. As we all know, resistance is quite a big issue for us, sort of in the industry. And we're not going to cover resistance in massive detail this evening. We're going to have another session, another webinar on resistance specifically in a couple of months' time. So we're not going to discuss that, but that's quite a big reason, is this whole resistance and efficacy story, because our wormers kind of are progressively, we're losing a lot of wormers out of the kind of armory for a lot of our farmers. So when and how often should we test? And maybe before we get into that, probably in when and how often, first, just a quick note on collecting samples. I know it's not the most pleasant job in the world, but it's vital we get this step right, Lesley, isn't it? And I think this is a bit of a pitfall for a lot of the industry, Lesley, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, taking a bad sample is going to give you a bad result, and it can be very misleading. So it's really important that we get this right. Yeah, and you've got there fresh. I always use the warm. So I've usually got gloves on, although I've been using them all in other ways recently. But you know, if I'm going to take a sample, I actually like to feel it that it's actually warm before you pick it up, because obviously if it's been there for a bit longer in warm conditions, then you could have had some hatching and you're going to miss some eggs. So it's got to be warm. It's got to be representative of the group being sampled. So what I hear a lot is that people will say, well, I went and I just sampled the ones that have got a bit of diarrhea, or I just sampled the ones that haven't. You've got to be really random about this, because otherwise the number of samples that we're taking will not give you a real representation of what's going on in the group. So that's really important. And if you're going to pool a sample yourself, if you're doing DIY or you're sending a pooled sample onto a lab, you must make sure that it's the same amount of poo from each animal. Otherwise, one animal will completely skew things. So really important to give yourself the best chance of getting a good result. And then when you've got it, put it in a good, a good bag, get the air out of it to keep it going, and keep it in a cool, dry place, and preferably in the fridge. One in the garage is better than one in the kitchen. Gets you into trouble.
Yes.
But you know, you can keep it in the fridge, and you know, be careful if you're going to send samples away. Then and use somebody who's going to do it for you. Don't be sticking it in the post on a Friday night, particularly not at the moment, because the post is dodgy, as Eurion and I have been finding with some projects that we've been doing. So, you know, just give yourself the best chance, and then you'll get a result that you can rely on and is going to be really meaningful.
Yeah. And we're not going to go into any details more than this about how to collect sample, because people have got different methods, etc. But just want to mention, you know, for our FECS users listening here, you know, we're not immune from all of this as well. You know, sort of, I sometimes have some horror moments when I hear some of our clients talking, sort of sometimes. You know, we have got some very clear instructions, video help as well on how to do this. So I encourage you know, to please read those instructions and you know, can't you know, underestimate how important this is. As I mentioned, a lot of our veterinary and kind of distributor clients here, sort of our clients of ours using this as a commercial user offering a service. We have got a number of these test kits in several of these places now for our commercial users, but not everywhere yet. COVID-19 disrupted our kind of putting these out there, but that's going to be resumed soon. So anybody offering a service using FECS, you know, sort of hopefully you can actually take these little test kit boxes with you, and they contain everything you need if you want to actually collect that sample. A good sample bag with a scoop and the gloves, but more importantly, you know, the instructions. But again, you know, those instructions are only good if you actually read them and use them. The submission label as well, it's actually very useful and very important for the vet or the SQP rammer who actually you're giving your sample to process, to have a little bit of background information about the animals as well. It's very important. So I think I'm going to prime Ryan now to actually put our poll up. We have a bit of a poll for you, everybody on here. I don't think we've quite overflowed to the YouTube channel yet, so everybody can take part in this poll. So if Ryan is there, can actually put the poll live. Hopefully this will appear. So what we want to know is, on average, how many fecal egg count samples do you test over the course of a year on average? Please sort of fill in your answers. And if you're a vet or a rammer, estimate how many per year your clients who test on average. Don't worry about those who don't test. But yeah, if you can actually fill in your answers now. So yeah, vets, rammers can actually estimate how much your clients or sort of you think you're doing. We'll just wait a wee while for that to come in, because I think this is very interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Kind of when we get into this in terms of what's out there in the industry.
There's quite a spread coming through that at the moment, Eurion. It's good.
There's quite a spread. Interesting. Yeah, it is interesting actually. I would say at this point, we are probably slightly skewed in this probably as well, because we have got a number of our users here. Sort of, you know, there's a number of people who are already converted, if you want, and advocates of that are actually already kind of part of this. So I think we're pretty much there now. Oh, there's another couple coming in. Yeah, I don't think there's any more. So I'll just end that poll and share the results if this works. I'm hoping sort of the audience can see this now. Please complain on chat or whatever if not. So yeah, So hopefully you can see those results. So there's a good spread there actually. Don't regularly test is actually only 3, only 6%, which is actually quite nice. But there is fair dominance in that bottom section below 10, sort of, so 25% between 5 and 10, less than 5, 24%. So yeah, about half of respondents here are doing less than 10. But it's great to see some up in the 20 to 50 and some of them more than 50. I probably know who some of these people are, and they're more than 50 here. Lesley does as well, a couple of them.
Yeah.
But so it is a spread, and we'll kind of bear these kind of results in mind, because we'll come to, if I minimize that, sort of, what do we mean by regular monitoring? So you shared with us what you're already doing. What do we mean? So I'm going to share with you now our top 10 users from 2019. Freeze me now, there we are. These are our top 10 farm users in 2019. So if you look at that middle column here, this is what we've gone by. This is the number of samples submitted by them using our FECS kit there on farm. I would kind of, so you can sort of, oops, laser pointer, use my laser pointer here. So this middle column here, I would point out that these are just the on-farm users, not people who send samples into commercial users. Interestingly, we do find the guys who do have kits on farm and using it and get used to using it are using them probably more than farmers sending samples in. We've got a couple of good farmers sending in to some vet practices, etc. But I think that's one thing we need to work on, is if you are using a commercial service provider, it'll be great to see more samples flowing into those people. But there's pretty, we're pretty impressed here. So I think obviously we've got a couple of these people who are listening in. So we've got, the top 10, we're doing between 50 and 83 samples a year here, which is great going. I put 2018 up as well, because to show you what they did in the previous year, because you can see there's some historic sort of long-standing clients here. And you can see, I put that up there just to show you that they were doing a lot of work in 2018. If those results didn't tell them anything and they didn't believe in what this was helping them, I'm sure they wouldn't have gone into the effort of doing this many samples in the following year. Because don't get me wrong, this does take time. Okay, so collecting samples in the field, can be kind of a bit time consuming. We have little tips about how you do that, and you have to use the kit and bring it out. But yeah, we were really pleased with this. And also 2020 usage, I put this in here because it's quite interesting. This is only up until the end of April. And you can see our best users have been using it a lot already. And we're not really, at the end of April, not really in that lamb grazing season yet, Lesley, are we? So
no, that's right. But, they're already in there having a look, seeing what's going on and really using the function of mapping out when things started to get going. And they did actually start quite early. So, they're getting into it early, which is great.
And I think I'd highlight here as well, a number of these samples early on were probably in ewes around lambing time as well, which we're going to come to in a bit. But, we mustn't forget those ewes in here as well. So that was really encouraging. And I'd say that's, the majority of our users, about 60%, I'd say, roughly of our users are in the 20 to 50 mark, which is still fairly good. We're getting good data out of there. That's pretty good, doing 30 to 50 mark, sort of, I say, yeah, pretty happy with that kind of volume of usage. We do have users, yes, who do less than 20, and, sort of, that's where we struggle to justify, the investment in what we do. If you're going to invest in this, you do need to open that box and use it, and not just use it, as actually using this data that comes out of it kind of sensibly as well. I would say, these are farmers. They're not kind of research farmers or whatever. These are proper commercial operations, sort of who are doing a great job of it. When to monitor fecal egg count, so that shows you what we've done. So I want to share with you now when we think you should be looking at doing fecal egg counts. Lambs, we can start from 6 weeks old, okay? There is some debate out there, people saying, oh, we shouldn't be using it for nematovirus, okay? We'll touch a bit on it, but we still advocate using it. We're just going to be very careful how we interpret results in light of nematovirus. We're not going to focus too much on this evening because, and if you look back on our social media, I did do a 4-minute video clip on there talking specifically about nematovirus. It was in the middle of April. So go back and have a look at that. But we can still use egg counting back then. You should be careful because it does pick up interesting stuff. If we decide not post fecal egg counts not to treat, please test them again fairly soon, please. This is a pitfall, Lesley, isn't it? You know, that people fall into, that people are actually testing, getting a low result, think they might be fine for a month. You know, things can change very, very quickly. And
They
it might be a
can.
reason why people sometimes don't believe in fecal egg counts, Lesley, isn't it?
It is, and I mean, we'll look at the life cycle in a minute, but what you've got to remember is that that fecal egg count is giving you a snapshot of the infected larvae the lambs ate about 3 weeks ago. So, you know, in 10 to 14 days, if 4 weeks ago they didn't eat very many, but 3 weeks they did, you can miss the slot. So that the regular treating and monitoring and keeping up is really important.
Absolutely. And then obviously if they're treated, you can test again in 3 to 4 weeks, unless you're doing a check for the treatment has worked, which I'll mention again. And the other thing is test each group separately as well, very importantly, because you'll find a lot of variation, and this will come up later on. I'm not going to dwell on this now, but this is a pitfall as well. People might test one group out of 5 groups on the farm and base the decision on worming all 5 groups just based on the result of one group. They can vary massively from group to group. We'll focus on that and go right through the season as well. You know, and again, we'll come back to this, but stores and new lambs in the winter time, don't forget about them. We know the conditions are changing, grass growth, etc. In the winter, these worms are popping up. The other element I discussed ewes very briefly and that kind of thing. You know, we can use fecal egg counting in ewes. Pre-tupping, not going to dwell on. We'll cover that again in the autumn in another webinar. But around lambing, getting the timing right. You know, I think, Lesley, you know, you're doing a bit of work, there's a bit of projects around this at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah, we are. I mean, we need to minimise the amount of treatment we give to ewes because it does tend to be at times when it can be highly selective for resistance. And pre-tupping, it is rare they need treating. I think what we've all got to remember really is that when we're treating ewes, most of the time what we're doing is not for the ewe's benefit, it is from the point of view of potential contamination. Hemoncosis is a slightly different issue, and if we get a question on that we can deal with it, but generally speaking it isn't a contamination issue, which it is around lambing as well. So what we're trying to do with the work, and Eurion's involved with this as well, with a group in Wales, some great data coming through, and we're trying to see if we can get better at identifying those few ewes that give us the most contamination. So, you know, obviously we're trying to persuade people to leave 10% untreated, but if it could be a lot more than 10%, then that would be much better from the point of view of sustainability. So, but using the FECS is really important for this. And I think, you know, we've perhaps not put enough emphasis on this area historically.
No, we haven't. Yeah, absolutely. And again, we'd like to cover this. You know, the webinars seem to be, you know, a fairly good kind of a platform for us. You know, so we'd like to do a series of these. So when we get into the next midwinter pre-lambing period, we might touch on this in more detail. And the other group, you know, rams, we tend to forget about rams.
Yeah, we do. And I just, you know, rams, pedigree rams particularly, the pedigree breeders online, don't take this the wrong way, but, you know, I mean, obviously some of them are doing something about FECS breeding and so on, but historically, you know, pedigree rams, and I hate to say it, guys, but males in particular, their immune system isn't quite as solid as we females.
We are the weaker sex, yes.
Exactly.
We are the weaker sex, yes.
In this context, you know, it's true. But the one thing I was just going to say here was that, you know, particularly with young rams, because what can happen is, you know, you're buying young rams over the summer to put them out in the autumn. And I've found over the years that sometimes those rams have come from really good homes, but those really good homes mean they haven't been challenged very much by worms. Yes. And they can walk into quite a challenge on a commercial farm. And suddenly you wonder why they're losing a lot of condition. So I just wanted to raise that really, because I think it's, I've seen that quite a lot. In fact, I've got a friend who's a pedigree ram breeder, and we got to the stage where actually we were deliberately, quietly introducing those ram lambs to some challenge without denting their performance, but making sure that we were giving them a challenge to their immunity build.
Yep, absolutely. And then the other monitoring FEC, as we said, check your wormer is working, you know, and we probably best time to do this is lambs mid-season. But again, and we're going to cover this in more detail in our next webinar, kind of, you know, in a month and a half time. So it comes to doing all these fecal egg counting, you know, the important thing then when we do these egg counts is what do they mean? You know, what do these egg counts mean? And again, this is a pitfall, again, you know, maybe not understanding quite what they mean. And just some guidance, one-off FEC is limited information, and you're better to do a series and build up a pattern of what's happening. And there's a lot of things that will influence this on a localized environmental kind of thing as well. We provide flowchart for our clients, and we'll go through a bit, these flowcharts and what it means, but it is a guide only, okay? So these things are a guide. And it's great to see that our guidelines and our thresholds as a guide, they are very similar, I think, to what the SCOP's new guidelines are, coming out soon. But the important thing as well, if you're not clear, speak to your vet, speak to your animal health advisor, your distributors. Please don't just go into the kind of store and just ask them, quiz them about which one's the cheapest wormer to buy or which one comes with a free jacket. These rammers have been specifically trained to kind of, to help you through the understanding of which worm is needed in these things, and they'll have some understanding around this. So please use those resources on your vets and your flock health plans. But to get into a bit more detail into interpreting, I'm going to flick these through this very quickly because the time's kind of escaping us. But we'll start with the top one, the likely to treat one. We tend to think, 500 EPG and above. We're talking about pooled or mob samples here now. So these are average kind of mob pool samples. If you're looking at individuals, you might take that threshold a bit higher, okay? And I know some organic farmers take this threshold a bit higher for pool as well. But above that, there might be, there's probably some individuals in the mob which will be getting a significant burden. The other thing to element, we think about, we treat animals to help what's inside their body to help them grow better, whatever. The other thing we're doing is actually helping avoiding contamination. So if these fecal egg counts are missed or whatever and stuff, there's significant contamination. So we got to bear that in mind as well. And that might come into what field they're on. I was talking to a client earlier today. It was on a field that's going to actually they're hoping to plough it up and put Swedes in if they can get around to it. But it's maybe it doesn't matter so much in those fields. And I think as here as well, I think the question here is, does all, at these FECS, do all the group need to be treated, Lesley?
Yeah, and I think, in fact, I was having this discussion again. I was having a discussion with somebody today, and not treating all the group is really good because it means we're not exposing unnecessarily. But one of the ways I find is easiest to get into this is, particularly when you start drawing lambs, your top lambs that are almost ready to go, they're not being bothered by the worm burden. So, that is a way that you can start thinking about maybe not needing to treat all at the same time without having to do lots and lots of weighing. Ideally, we get there eventually, but you can do it just simply when you start drawing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we'll go to the kind of mid-range ones, the 200 to 500 EPG, like a moderate, and this is a possibly treat, and it's important here, and it's important at all times. Fecal egg counting is only one element, isn't it? You put that alongside or everything else that you're measuring or can noticing with these animals, as you don't we?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where your point about a one-off FEC has limited. Please don't ring either of us up with one FEC out of nowhere and no background information because we can't interpret it really. You will get a barrage of questions. And it does depend on how well they're doing, etc. And we do need this information. It's really important.
Yeah. And you can see there's a number of elements in that middle there that we consider. As I said, we're going to share these slides with you afterwards, so we'll just kind of flick on, and then to the last kind of the unlikely to treat. You can see the language we use here. We don't say treat, don't treat, maybe treat. We say unlikely, likely, because there's other factors at play. There's our exceptions here as well. The nematodirus, that's a big pitfall. I've still got some clients now who are actually doing FECS early on, and we tell them, look, even if there's a risk period, look at the SCOPS forecasts. If you know this history in the fields, don't rely too much on it. We still want you to do it because we might find other things which we'll come to, but really watch out for that. There might be poor individuals, but I think the big one, as well here now as well, what's the implications of this drought period, and watch out when this drought breaks. That's one pitfall, when we're in these drought periods. And I might flick onto this, bring up the life cycle. We can't have a worm talk without a life cycle up. But I'm just putting this up here to help explain, helps interpret fecal egg counts. Lesley mentioned earlier, what we're doing in fecal egg counts, we're counting eggs at this point. But at this point, there's already adults in here. And those adults would have, from the time they pick up the infection to when they're laying eggs, 16 to 21 days, around that 3-week mark. So when you've got eggs, they've already been in there for 3 weeks. So that's quite important when we're interpreting egg counts. And I think, Lesley, you know, it's going to be interesting, you know, this drought period, you know, the conditions we need here for these larvae to hatch out of the eggs and be on the grass. Those conditions might not be necessarily there because we need a bit of moisture and stuff, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it might be a bit too dry and hot,
but I think we were talking about this earlier on, weren't we? You know, we did see some quite high FECS quite early this year, so that suggests that there was contamination early on. So those little devils are sat there in that dung at the moment, you know, going through the first and second stages in the dung, quite safe and happy, and they'll just be waiting for some moisture now to explode, really. And I think, you know, you were saying earlier on, weren't you, about the value of fecal, doing monitoring. And this is where it's really going to come into its own this year, because people could get seriously caught out by the drought if they're just relying on, you know, worming every 3 to 4 weeks like they used to. They're going to miss this completely, a lot of them. So really important. We're seeing some quite low FECS at the moment, but when it rains very quickly after that, these animals will start to eat lots of these infected 3rd stage larvae. They'll hatch, they'll move up, and they'll be sitting in their water droplets on the grazing, and away you'll go. You'll get a massive influx. So we've got to be monitoring carefully, and that's when, downstream of that, you will need to start to take some advice really from your vet or your RAMA as to the influence in terms of you know, what the FEC actually means, because it's going to be you know, important to interpret it correctly.
Yeah, because if it happens in that big mad rush, you know what I mean, there could be just, you know, significant damage done before we pick up eggs here potentially. It's still good to regular monitor eggs, but just be careful if you know the history of the field.
And also, you know, if you were doing some monitoring earlier on now, what a lot of my guys now know is where their red hot fields are already. They will know where their mobs were, where we were getting counts of 700 and 800 a month ago. And those are the areas we'll want to watch, because, you know, we always used to call it July disease when I was younger. You know, lambs would start to scour and look really sick, and you weren't getting egg counts. And it is sometimes that you get this, where you get this rush of immatures. So, you know, having done some monitoring, these guys who've done a lot already will know where the hotspots are.
I think confounding this issue is, you know, the immune system of these lambs as well. You know, for them to build up, you know, that immunity, they do need to be challenged. So when they're grazing out there now, if there's not too many of these little pesky critters on the grass, they might not be getting that much of a challenge to build up that kind of immunity. So you've got the double whammy of a lot of larvae and maybe kind of, you know, lambs that are very vulnerable because they haven't started to build up much immunity as well. You know, that's a double whammy sometimes, isn't it?
It's true, you know, and over this part of the country, how long our drought lasts, probably longer than yours in Wales. And you know, we have seen years where it's been very, very dry, and you know, we normally say lambs are building up. You can get some immune response demonstrated between 4 and 5 months of age. It's not really solid, but you can see it. But if they've had no challenge, as Eurion says, you know, we could have lambs at 5 and 6 months old in the autumn that will fall over at a moderate challenge. So, you know, we need to be aware of that and keep up with what people are saying and the sort of information that's being put out by people like Eurion, where people are doing a lot of testing.
Fantastic. So let's get on to our exciting data. Both Lesley may get very excited with what we find when we actually start looking what people have been doing and what the results look like. So what does our data tells us? As you know, with the FECPAC system, we collate this data and we can use this anonymously. So this is a little bit of patterns we find. And this is stuff that we pulled off our system. And just to remind you here as well, and tell you here for all our clients, we can do this for you guys, you know, on a farm basis or on a practice or a store basis, you know, looking what's happening over the season in your store or on your individual farm. So we can actually pull this data off now. There's a proviso to that. We need good data going in. We need enough data sets going in to be able to show something meaningful, but contact us, you know, and we can do this for you. It's part of a development that we will be developing a dashboard for you to be able to extract these kind of things yourselves. That's coming in the future, but contact us, please. But this graph here shows a difference between 2 years for you. So those green bars, they're the average fecal egg counts in 2018, and the blue bars are the average fecal egg counts in 2019. We have to be careful when dealing with averages, Lesley, don't we? But it's still an interesting pattern here, isn't it? So
it is, you know, I mean, it's showing you the 2 years are quite different. You know, people sometimes think, oh, well, you know, I know what happens on my farm. Well, we don't. We know they're very different. And I found that really interesting in terms of just the level of the FECS counts in the autumn, you know, just emphasising the point you made earlier on that we need to keep going into the autumn because we are seeing very high counts.
Absolutely. Yeah, keep going right going to the autumn. So that's one pitfall there is people stop around September. They think, oh, the worm season's over. The other pitfall I just want to kind of highlight that Lesley did touch on was, I think a pitfall we've seen with some of our clients is they might do a fair bit of testing in year 1 and year 2, and they might find a similar-ish pattern and they think, oh, well, that's the pattern for my farm. But it changes massively from year to year. You can see here the peak 2018 was August, September. 2019, it was much further on in October. So that's the kind of first one, just very simply comparing averages between 2 years. And this one is actually looking at right now, let's look at the last 7 weeks and compare to the same 7 weeks last year. So we're looking at April and May. So obviously this is up until kind of the weekend, until last Friday, I think. So this is why it only goes up to week 3 in May. So the bars here, so this isn't the total egg count, this is strong isles only. So these are the average strong isle egg counts for you. And the blue bars here are the strong isle egg counts we find in 2019 and in the same 7 weeks. And this is what's happened this year, okay? A couple of things I want to highlight here. Why do we tell people to test early on? This is all part of my video nematodirus early on, because it's just not just nematodirus we're dealing with in April sometimes. And if you've got white wormer resistance, you know, maybe for farms, you know, who've got highish egg counts or strong isles, we might need to consider something else. You know, and yet the averages here aren't very high, okay? But these are strong isles alone. When we add nematodirus, they get a bit higher, the averages. But remember, an average means there's zeros in here, which means we'll have some FECS up quite high. But I think there's a distinct, you know, difference between the two, even though they're fairly low FECS overall. You know, we can see maybe the dry season 2020 here for strong isles, you know, maybe showing itself up in kind of these lower counts, but we're still in a dry season. So what's happened here? You know, last week, these green bar, that's kind of, that average has gone up quite a bit. And I'm going to pull some data out, individual data out from a few days just to show this as well. I would stress here as well, you know, maybe slightly skewed because the later we go, the more testing happens. We see some testing here, but a lot of more testing that farmers test later on in the season. I'm going to overlay now the nematodirus. So the nematodirus I've put as lines, sort of we put as lines there to show the difference. But again, the green line is last year, blue line is last year, the green line is this year. They're actually running fairly similar. There's nothing much to kind of show there. I guess is to show is actually, in terms of egg counts, you know, the strong isles are just as dominant as nematodirus early on. It's kind of patterns that we're finding, isn't it?
It is. We're getting milder winters, and so we are seeing more carryover. And one of the, obviously the downsides of that is we're seeing these strong isles waking up early. Mm-hmm.
And just to touch on very quickly, I know we're getting over our half hour limit, well over a half hour kind of time we were hoping to keep to. But I just wanted to pull out, you know, just 2 days. This is actually Sunday and Monday. So even on a bank holiday, our farmers are busy testing. Look at them. So you can see clients here. So we got 5 farmers total here. And you can see the FECS here. These are sort of, there's a mixture here of lambs and some other stock classes. But generally, we're seeing low FECS. So despite being a drought, don't get caught out into thinking that we're just going to not have any worm issues, okay? Because look at what we picked out here. If I just pick out this first one here, 1,015, remember our threshold is 500, so that's a pretty high one. This is from Farm A, and Farm A, this is Claire Wise actually up in County Durham, one of our AIM farms. I spoke to her earlier just to make sure that the details here, we got them correct, and the wormer types, etc. But look at it, 4 tests on lambs, you know, 3 of them were in that medium category and 1 of them was pretty high, you know, so that shows you, as I said earlier, don't just rely on one group to decide what to do for all your groups. Test each group separately where it's feasible, because if you'd have tested this group here, for example, and made a decision for all your lambs, you might not have treated them, and look what you missed here, okay? Quite important for the people selling wormers here as well, because if they only gave you a bag of poo from this field, you might have sold any wormer, whereas if they gave you from everything, at least you've sold a little bit kind of to here, I guess, you know, and it's needed here as well. The other element here as well is, look, they were treated on May the 4th with a white wormer, and the condition was excellent. So sometimes those eggs are up there before it says in their condition. Claire told me these were early lambers as well, and some of these lambs were touching 40 kilos at 11 weeks of age in this kind of early lamb sort of. So, sometimes they can look fine and it catches you out. So yeah, treated on the 4th of May, that's just 20 days since they were treated. So those egg counts have actually shot up. The other thing we actually look out for as well is actually look, they were treated here. There might be white wormer resistance happening here, which is why we've got some strong dials, okay? Because it's fairly quick afterwards, 20 days, not quite up to a 21-day cycle. Nematodirus has got a shorter pre-patent period, might explain here. But what it might show you is actually, you need to work back sometimes when you look at egg counts, is actually this field was probably quite a dirty field for my stock. And you can now, label that field as being a bit of a dirty field. And if you can, maybe avoid putting your growing lambs on there later in the season, etc. Pick up another one here. This is interesting, 630 eggs per gram. I had a chat to this client yesterday. They're down in Hampshire, I think they are. Treated with ivermectin. Now, if you look here, these are ewes. Now, these are late lambing ewes, so they're April lambing, and these were the third lot of ewes lambing, so they were end of April. So this was their kind of lambing dose, if you want. He does them just after lambing when he can handle them, first of all. And they did have a high egg count beforehand. They were 770. So that's disappointing here. Now, this is actually raising questions over ivermectin for this farm. We've got to be careful. What we know here is the treatment has been ineffective. We're going to be careful just labeling that as resistance straight away. Because he did say he didn't worm them himself. He one of the workers did. So, but he is going to definitely do a efficacy test on the back of this. He's actually done a lot more testing today, actually, since I spoke to him, and we are getting some high FECS in his ewes, which is interesting, something to investigate. We need to put him investigation into. And just from Sunday, Monday alone, there's 3 interesting stories. Another kind of interesting egg count after treating with moxidectin this time, the long-acting sort of 3 ml wormer. In all cases, I phoned them, they had treated every animal in the group. That's quite important as well. But there is something here which is obviously raising some suspicions. But again, it's a treatment failure rather than resistance at this stage. But he definitely says, I really want to go and look now, because his belief was he did worm them correctly, he was weighing them, etc. So that's quite interesting. But yeah, 3 stories there just from 2 days of testing. Quite interesting, Lesley.
Yeah, very interesting. Yep.
Right, we're going to race on. I'm not going to dwell too much on these because we are kind of running kind of short of time. But the role of nutrition is fairly important in all this, Lesley, looking at other things we can do to reduce the void challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And with lambs, particularly, in terms of their ability to mount their immune response, the value of that is going to be nutrition. If they're on good grazing and they're being managed really well and they're growing really well, that also has a benefit in terms of how well their immune system will mount that, and they can meet the challenge. Absolutely,
yeah. There's things we can breed sheep that are actually more resistant and resilient if you went against these worms. I think that's going to play an important part. We're probably going to come back to this in our September webinar, actually. But there are ram breeders out there who are using this technology in their breeding values, and I think that's going to play a role in reducing contamination. The other thing as well, there's lots of other things that fall into here, using herbalaise and all these kind of things. There's lots of management factors we can do. But I think the big thing that we're doing, we've talked a lot about using fecal egg count in its simplest sense, if you went about when to treat and what to trot. But a lot of this is building a picture of what's happening on your farm, planning for the future. So use those flock health plans, etc. Speak to your advisors. Contamination mapping comes into that. So exactly what we talked about before, identifying maybe fields that are worse for worms on your farm and deciding what stock to put there. So yeah, we're all about monitoring to manage. That for me is a big part of what egg counting is about, is actually doing this on a regular basis, building up a picture and being able to sit down, analyze and look what we can do with management. Cool, we'll get into I'm not going to dwell on this. I was going to hop onto our website, but please go onto this afterwards. Where to get FECS done. Obviously, we've talked a lot about our kind of on-farm system and the success of those. It's not for everybody, don't get me wrong. And there's people here who'll be using, their different systems through vets or whatever. but we've got a number of commercial providers now dotted around the country who are providing a service with fecal egg count. We've got a brand new page, UK page launched last week. Hop onto the UK page there, have a look at the FECS testing providers, and it'll show you who's the commercial providers there. It's not quite full yet. There's a couple of people we need to come back to tell us, that they're happy to put on the map. There's a few gaps to fill in, but that will show you, is there anybody locally I can send my samples to? So yeah, this is just to close off really, to say that before we get into the questions, just to make an important point, applying SCOP's principles, we've got to look at this as being an investment and not a cost. And there's a lot of kind of places we can get rewards, reducing wormer use, not worming inappropriately, improving performance as well. Again, we'll cover this £12 a lamb there from effective versus ineffective wormers. Work we did in the Sainsbury's project. We did a large project with Sainsbury's. You can read all about that on our website. And we'll cover this more in our next webinar as well. As I said, telling this positive food story is important as well. Reduced chemical input, welfare. Actually, these little critters have a big impact on our emissions and efficiency. So they do have a role to play in reducing that as well. And obviously resistance development is avoiding that. So just and very quickly before the questions, just to advertise our next webinars, as I mentioned, the ones that are about resistance, because we haven't really touched very lightly on, only touched very lightly tonight. We're going to have Fiona Lovett with us from Flock Health on the 16th of July is the provisional date for that. It'll be mid-July, but we're pretty sure it'll be 16th of July. Please keep an eye out for that. And we're going to get more into the nitty-gritty of resistance, how to test, what the results mean, and also discussing the difference between resistance and efficacy of treatment as well. And we'll bring in the 4th and 5th wormer groups then as well. We'll probably run another one in the autumn, and that's just a reminder of the resource that's there for you to be able to use. So thank you for listening, and hopefully we can bring Hevin in now to actually, so Hevin is our Sales and Relationship Manager. He is an SQP or a RAMA in his own right, and he's been monitoring the questions as they come through. And I can see we've got a couple of questions, a few questions up there. There we are, Hevin.
Hiya. Yeah, we'll jump straight in, shall we?
Yes, absolutely, yeah, because we have run a bit
So
over.
this one was from Twitter this afternoon. If there was no resistancy issues on my farm and all my wormers worked, would I bother with doing FECS?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, you can start off with if you want, yeah, and I'll come back on it, yeah.
I mean, I think well, hopefully, I was watching the questions and I think that one came through quite early on. I mean, the answer is yes, you would, for all the reasons that we've discussed, is that, it isn't all about we're not trying to get people to use a lot less wormer necessarily, although we would like you to. We'd like to reduce our reliance on wormers full stop. But it's also about getting the timing of the wormer that we use right. And targeting the right animals so we get the best response. So I would say, even setting aside the resistance issues, we're still going to get better worm control by adopting all of these principles. And by the way, we will also slow down the development of resistance.
Absolutely, and I just put this slide back up actually because resistance only plays an effect, in two of these points here really. So people are even worming with an effective wormer at the wrong time. They're not going to get the full benefit out of that wormer, for example. And the positive food story, we shouldn't be blanket treating our food producing animals anyway now. It's becoming a bit of a no-no, doing the blanket treatment across kind of all animals. So that's a big kicker as well in terms of, one of the reasons why Sainsbury's were really interested in getting involved in the project with us, is that kind of food retailer side. I will say as well, even, even with fully effective wormer, dealing, just living and accepting a high parasite challenge on your farm and just having wormers blitzing it all the time isn't the most effective control. We need to be able to work to manage worm populations. To have less worms on farm is far more effective than just accepting a high challenge and worming all the time. Those wormers only kill what's in the body at that point, other than some of the long-acting wormers, obviously. But between those regular treatments, if there's larvae going over the tongue, they start doing damage, so actually we can still use fecal egg counts to try and manage our farms to try and reduce the overall challenge on the farms. And I think that's how we need to be approaching worm control.
Yeah, and I think the other element of it as well, as we touched on, is the development of immunity. So where people are just going in and regularly worm, they are getting lambs into the autumn that have not had a chance to properly develop that immunity. And it also applies to ewes as well. I mean, the ewe's immune system works for her, but it works best when it continues to have a small challenge, which she carries herself. So another reason why we really don't want people treating ewes unnecessarily is that if we do that, we're removing that little challenge and we're not doing her immune system any favours. So it's finding that balance. We're never going to get rid of worms completely. We have to learn to live with them. As Eurion says, we can reduce the challenge, but we can also harness the ability of the animal to be able to do that for us as well. So it's getting that balance right.
Yep.
Okay, next question. Scott's forecast for my area last week was very high. Lifted samples and left them with my vet, but treated lambs with a white wormer. Vet came back to report no worms in samples. Lambs are thriving well, averaging 52 days old, with a daily live weight gain of 350 grams.
Okay.
When should I lift samples again?
Okay, so what the vet reported was that there were no eggs in the samples. So basically, that's not really telling us too much about whether or not nematodirus was there, because as we've said before, nematodirus is actually, it's the immatures which causes the problem. So it might be that there were immatures there and the drench killed them, and there are no egg-laying adults there to be seen now. The forecast is a risk. So obviously those lambs were just over 7 weeks old, so they would be in the risk period. I would be looking now for those lambs in terms of nematodirus. If there's a risk, I'd be looking at their growth rate. If they're going along nicely by now, they should be developing some immunity. In terms of roundworms, having treated them, you don't say what you treat, your white dose, a white dose.
White wormer, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So really, in that sense, you could go back in at 14 days to see if there's anything there. That would be roundworms. If you want to check for nematodirus, you would go back in at 8 or 9 days.
Yeah.
But I don't know what your actual risk was. That's the problem.
Yeah, I'd agree with that and stuff. You know, I mean, it depends on the condition and how the lambs are doing, but you know, there was no worms detected. You know, what we saw with in the table I showed there was, you know, eggs getting quite high 20 days after treatment, even the strong girls. Now the question there is, were the juvenile strong girls not egg laying there yet? You know, sort of at that point, you know, maybe a test in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, it depends whether or not. Yeah, it depends whether or not you want to check the efficacy for nematodirus, or whether or not you want to go back in. So 2 to 3 weeks before you take another sample would be ideal. Yeah.
I'll jump in with this question. I think this question ties quite well with the last one. Treated my lambs with a white wormer 3 weeks ago. Did a FECS today and got a highish count. Now this is a client who got a count of 405 eggs per gram. For just nematodirus, should I be concerned, and should I treat again?
Well, in terms of concern, I mean, we can't say from that whether or not there was any resistance issues. I mean, obviously there's now some mature. It's impossible to say really at this stage, because it depends on how well those lambs are doing. I would now be asking questions about the age of the lambs, how well they're performing, and lots of other questions around that as to whether or not you need to go back in and treat again for nematodirus.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, yeah.
Okay, next one we've got, do we need to monitor differently if homuncus is an issue on our farm?
I don't think you maybe need to monitor on it's monitoring might be the same. It's how interpreting the accounts. Now I'm going to pass this definitely to Lesley. Homuncus is more.
I thought you might pass that, because as soon as
we don't find so much homuncus here in the West, but I know you deal with a lot of clients who deal with homuncus issues.
Yeah,
and have been doing a lot of testing around. Yeah.
I mean, the first thing I would say to anybody who's listening, if you haven't got Haemonchus, then please don't get it and follow the quarantine routine in terms of treatments, because you really don't want this. Haemonchus is really very unpredictable. There are some which say that ewes don't become as immune to Haemonchus. One of the things I've found over the last few years is that it's extremely variable between individuals. So you will find that some ewes are really badly affected and others aren't. But regular FECS are absolutely critical with it, to know what's going on, to try and get some warning, and to combine that with watching the condition of the animals very carefully, using what we call a Famacha test, so looking at how pink around the eyes are, because Haemonchus won't make them scour, so you don't get that scouring warning. Basically, when it catches people for the first time, the first thing you can see is dead animals. And one of the vets on a course I did last week had a really good point. She's from a Haemonchus area, and she said, well, actually, what I do when I'm looking at the whites of the eyes of these guys, I actually make sure I wear white gloves, which I thought was really good, because if you've got a white glove next to the eye, you're going to get a much better idea. So, but monitoring carefully and contamination mapping, absolutely critical to know where the hot spots are on a farm.
Yeah.
And
they're huge egg layers, aren't they? They put a lot of eggs.
They are huge egg layers. So the first sniff that you often get is a very high egg count when you were not expecting. And by a very high egg count, I mean thousands usually. I had a count last year that came in at 64,000. Unfortunately, it was an organic dairy flock, so that's just a bit of a problem. But you know, then the thing about Haemonchus is as well, it'll pack its bags and go away, and you won't see it for maybe several seasons. But the worry I have is that this year is just shaping up to be a bit of a perfect storm. Haemonchus likes these long dry spells, and then we get a wet spell, and bang, it'll come. So we need to be really careful.
So thinking about those FECS and the ewes I mentioned in that table, you know, from the ones tested the last few days, you know, sort of in my head, you know, it might not be too early for Haemonchus coming up on those ewes, you know, in this dry hot period. They're down in Hampshire, kind of.
No, it might not. I would normally, I mean, June, I would normally in that part of the world say that we could be running into the risk period. So, you know, the best thing to do is to start monitoring those ewes. And as I say, what you tend to find in adult animals is that some of them are perfectly okay. And then you'll go in others and you find that these are ones that are not gaining condition as we might expect them to do now as they're going through lactation. And again, as I say, they're looking at the salmon bit, it should be salmon around the eyes, and it goes very white when they start to get anemic. I'd talk to you better about that. You know, they'll be able to help you with looking at that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, like this question here, is there an optimum worm burden to stimulate an immune response in lambs?
There probably is, but don't ask me what's that optimum worm burden is. It's probably oh look, it is, and for me, worm control, we don't want to get rid of all the worms, because you know we want those lambs to build up that immune system. So yeah, the whole management of a farm is trying to manage it that we get a little bit of worm burden in to stimulate that immune system, but not so much that it affects the performance. Not an easy thing to achieve. But you know, these are parts of the conversation where we talk about contamination mapping or whatever and stuff. You know, and you know, if you've got fat lambs which are destined to go to the slaughter within the next 6 to 8 weeks, we don't care that much about them building up immunity. You know, they go on your cleaner pastures. But your ewe lamb replacements, if you're breeding your own replacements, for example, you know, maybe putting on the cleanest pastures on the farm and isn't the best place for them if you've got those clean pastures, because maybe stimulating them with a bit of a worm burden is going to help them later in their life. But getting the balance is a tricky one, isn't it, Lesley?
Yeah, it is, but that's a really important point. I mean, how many ewe lambs have I seen over the years fall over in that first winter and through into the next spring because they haven't had a chance to develop their immunity? So like you, I don't think there is a number that we have, but it's going to be, you know, significant enough for them to be challenged to mount that immune response, definitely. So yeah, you know, quite often, you will find that some lambs will go straight all the way through and they don't need any treatment, and they've maybe been tickling on a fecal egg count of 100, 200 all season, and that certainly seems to do the trick. But yeah, difficult to say. They need to be challenged, and they need to be challenged on little and often.
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. Next question is, when in the UK should we be incorporating I'm going to try and say this properly, the Intonia flagrans in worm control regimes to reduce maternal shedding?
I think when we've got a bit more evidence. Okay, so for those who don't know, this is a fungus which can be applied to pasture, and which actually is anthelmintic, really. I mean, it does kill off nematodes, and it has got potential. I haven't actually been involved directly in any work with it, but I follow it with interest, and I don't think that we should be looking at it. I think one of the issues is everything's multifactorial, and it's going to be quite difficult to incorporate it practically at a level that's going to make a big difference. But that doesn't mean to say I'm dispelling it. It's something that we're keeping an eye on.
Something is really interesting, and our Antipodean friends were probably a better place to comment on this, because I think they use it a bit in Australia, and I think it's Australia they've started marketing this, I believe. So our partners there in New Zealand might have a bit more information. From what I understand, I think it's used a lot in the equine world, or that's where it's targeted initially, but they're looking at using more in sheep. I think it's an interesting one to keep an eye on. Yes, there definitely may be a benefit, and we need to look at all options that help us not having to rely on the chemical wormer option. And one of the things that struck me was, what I believe, it's got to be fed into the animal. So it's fed into the animal, which means it comes out in the dung. So the fungus then grows in the dung and actually kind of destroys the larvae and the eggs or whatever, and eats them. So we probably are seeing more and more people moving to a grass-based system. So we need, how are we going to feed these fungus get the fungus into the animals? I think that's a question we've got to tackle as well. But it's, there's not enough information yet, but it's keep our options open.
I think relative to the strides that people, some of the breeding programs that are going on now, reducing shedding by ewes through breeding and harnessing that, it's going to be interesting to see how those two things sit next to each other.
Absolutely.
Okay, another question we've had from Twitter. Why are new wormer groups so expensive, making prohibitive for farmers like me to use them?
I might start off then. We're going to tackle those fourth and fifth group wormers in the next webinar with Fiona. But what do we mean by expensive, I suppose? And which is most expensive? Is it maybe a 40 pence a dose, whatever they are, kind of works out at for those strong lambs, wormer, which works fully effective, or a 10p a dose wormer, which only kills half of what it's meant to kill? Which in the long run is the most expensive? We sort of, there might be an argument to say, are the other wormers too cheap? Not a popular one to say in the farmer audience, I know. But maybe, maybe that's the argument, is that the other ones are too cheap. We might not be using them quite, or would have used them quite as much in the past. Why they're expensive, it takes a long time to develop these things, and a lot of formulations, not many make it through to be a product, Lesley. I don't know. Your views?
I mean, one of them in particular is probably more expensive to produce than the other. But I'm with you on this. I think for a long time, certainly all of my career, wormers have been too cheap. So it's been relatively easy to go in there with some of them costing a few pence a dose. I don't view these ones as expensive, because the benefit, if they're used in the ways that we actually suggest people use them. So, what we're saying is you would use them as one or other for an incoming quarantine dose. And we've already had the conversation about Haemonchus. And, that is one sure way that you're not going to be bringing Haemonchus onto your farm, and you really don't want it. But also resistance to the other groups. And the other one is this mid to late season dose, which, you're going to cover in the next webinar. But there are, the big advantages of that are that you're taking out any build-up of resistant worms to your other groups. So if you like, you're unstitching that season's damage to a large extent from having to worm previously. But a lot of people, I know a lot of my people, particularly when we're monitoring growth rates, is that if your lambs are carrying that burden of resistant worms that you haven't been able to clear out all season, you do get that benefit in terms of performance. So personally, I have no problem justifying that cost to my clients, providing they're monitoring the benefits that they're getting.
Yep.
Excellent. Right, another question. A little bit off topic for Nematodirus and strong gals, but cocci counts using FECS. Do we always need to speciate before treatment?
Do you want me to take that one?
Take it, yeah, and I'll give my view.
Yeah,
I'll give you a bit of an update on where we're at with this as well, yeah.
Yeah, okay, because I know, well, Aaron, I'll just say something and you can say where you are with that. But with coccidiosis, again, it's a risk factor. So for me, yeah, it's nice to get speciation to prove it, but actually for me, if you've got a high cocci count, and I think one of the things that, and I know Eurion and I have discussed this in the past, is that a high cocci count is like thousands higher than a strong dial count, so we mustn't get carried away. But cocci and nematodirus together are a lethal combination, and you've got to interpret in terms of how the lambs look, how they're doing. So a high cocci count, my first question to somebody is, well, how do they look? How do they look? Because I know that really fit, healthy lambs, you can have 1 million pathogenic coccidia inside them, and actually they're absolutely fine. So it's, again, like the FECS, it's all down to the interpretation and the information that goes around that.
Absolutely, and just in terms of that, one of the frustrations we have, or I've had anyway with the G2 system is we're not currently a reliable count for coccicysts. So we validate everything, and we assumed, because our roundworm eggs came up nice and nicely and validated nicely, that the cocci would, but they don't. We lose them a bit in the meniscus and sedimenting. However, we haven't it's something we've really been working on. But we'd only be able to give you a count, like Lesley said, which isn't the full picture anyway. However, it doesn't mean that's not important, and it's something that we are working on fixing. And actually, a bit of update news here: we have just received confirmation of some funding to start a project later this year, which is a feasibility project, which is not only to it'll push on the development of the cocci test, but looking at the feasibility of speciating these just from looking at the cysts, using computer imaging software. We don't know it's going to be possible, so don't please hold on to any promises here. It is a feasibility, and the outcome of the feasibility might come out, no, you can't do it. But it's something that we are going to be looking at, because that could get quite exciting if we are able to speciate to pathogenic, non-pathogenic, fairly immediately from a fresh stool sample. It's quite a big game changer, in helping with that. But even then, there's still be caveats to interpreting them as well. Is there anything else, Eurion? Or
Yeah, this is quite a good question. If you leave some lambs untreated, can this give misleading post-drench FEC counts?
Absolutely.
Sure can. Yeah, if you're going to do that and you're going to go down the TST group T route, then you do need to make sure that if you want to do a post-drench efficacy, you mark those lambs that are, that weren't treated, and you can shed them off before you actually take a sample. Yeah. So yeah, very, very good point.
This is actually something, that we spoke to our clients before I put those 3 figures up from our clients, and Heaven, you spoke to one of them, as you know, and one of them was to check, had you wormed all that group, because, that can come up just because they left 20% untreated. It is rare. I think early on in lambs, young lambs, maybe we should be avoiding doing that, but as lambs get stronger, a bit better immunity, that's when that policy comes in. But yeah, absolutely. We need to be very careful with that.
Very good point.
I think this is the last question of the evening. In France, vets think that fecal, I think he's referring to fecal egg count reductancy test is at 95%. Is good. What do you think of it? For me, it must be 100%.
Oh, the joys of fecal egg count reduction tests. And again, our next webinar will probably delve a bit more into here. you know, there's a lot of good science that sets it at 95%. I've just been in the middle in a talk this morning, actually, and there's some new things and guidelines coming out of Europe research group on this. Look, fecal egg counts and fecal egg count reduction tests have got their kind of limits, if you want, and kind of, you know, their own pitfalls. So, you know, that's been set. I think there's good reason, sort of, you know, for setting in that. Yes, I always like to see it at 100%, but even having it at 100%, I think this is Sebastian who asked this. Having it at 100% doesn't necessarily mean always that it's killed absolutely everything. It all depends on how that egg count reduction test has been set up, you know, sort of and tailored and so on, and what your egg counts actually are. And there's a lot of statistics to apply around this as well, which are a bit above my head. Sort of, but it's our gold standard we go at, isn't it, Lesley?
It is. It's all about stats and reliability, and you know, nothing's 100% anyway. So even, you know, when products are actually first licensed and so on, for us to say that they are absolutely 100% effective against all species is just not going to be. So sometimes, you know, you're going to be getting a count and it's not a pathogenic species. It might be a dose limiting species that's coming through. You know, so the 95% gives us the best view of things in the field. And obviously you'll talk about drench test next time, but in drench test, we tend to use a 90% as being an indication.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I think that's
all the questions. So that's all the questions that have come in tonight. I'll hand it back to you now.
Yeah, and if there's any other questions that come through and stuff, please send them through. We'll aim to maybe answer them on email when we send the slides through. So yeah, thank you all for listening in, folks, and thanks. You know, a lot of you, we are 20-25 minutes over time, over what we targeted our time. It's great to see the majority of you stuck with us until now, so it's great. Let you get on to your teas or suppers or whatever if you haven't had that. And thank you very much, and massive thank you to Lesley for helping us out this evening and taking part and sharing your vast knowledge of the subject.
It was. I really enjoyed it. It's been very good, and as you say, people have stuck with us. So good night, everybody,
and great questions. So thank you very much. And take care.
Good night.
Brilliant. Take care, folks. Cheers. Bye.